Hi, you're watching A Question of Faith. My name is Brendan Malone, and in this episode, I've been asked to answer the question, what does a meaningful response to suffering look like for a Christian? As Christians, how do we grapple with and contend with those deep and painful moments in our life without falling into superficiality or without doing things which are highly destructive to our faith? First of all, I think there's some important things that we need to sort of get our head around before we get into the practicality. So let me lay out a bit of a framework and some important points that I think must always be considered when we think about the reality of suffering in the context of the Christian faith. First of all, God is not a spiritual Santa Claus. That is not the teaching of Christianity. Yes, we profess a belief and a hope that at the end of time, at the end of our lives, we will find ourselves living the fullness of joy and a life of completion without suffering, and that total relationship without any sort of interruption, any sort of intrusion, any sort of harm when we find ourselves in heaven with God. But in this life, Christianity does not say that there is meant to be no suffering. In fact, if you believe that Christianity is a get-out-of-jail-free card when it comes to human suffering, you have a false vision of Christianity. You have an anemic understanding of Christianity that is very, very lacking. You see, the resurrection is a central and fundamental component of our faith, but so too is the cross. You don't have a resurrection without the cross. You often hear people saying, we are the Easter people, and they're usually talking about the resurrection. They're talking about Easter Sunday. That is true, but what we can forget when we say that is that to be an Easter people also entails the cross. It also entails us embracing our cross, which is exactly what Christ tells us, that if we want to follow him, we have to pick up our cross. A cross is an instrument of difficulty, challenge, and great suffering. And that is what Christ tells us we have to pick up if we want to follow him. A cross without a resurrection is a deficient, nihilistic, barbaric thing, but a resurrection without a cross is also woefully deficient. Easter isn't just about Easter Sunday, it's also about the suffering of the cross. It's about the darkness and the desolation and the loneliness of Easter Saturday, where God is seemingly gone and dead to those who know and love him most. So it's important to understand that suffering is not something incompatible with your Christian faith. Don't think I'm suffering, something is going wrong here. Secondly, and this is related to this, is your suffering is not necessarily a sign of God's abandonment or that you are out of God's favor, as some might say. Jesus is very clear about this in the Gospels. In Matthew chapter 5, he says that the rain falls on the righteous and the unrighteous alike, that God sends that rain. He causes the sun to set and to rise on both the evil and the good. It's not like if you are receiving an abundance of good things in your life and there's minimal suffering, somehow you are more favored than someone who is experiencing great and deep pain and suffering. In Luke chapter 13, Christ refers specifically to an incident that the crowd he is speaking to raises with him when they talk to him about some Galileans who have had their blood mixed and mingled with the sacrifices to the pagan gods by Pilate. And obviously this is an awful, unclean and vile sort of abomination for those people. But Jesus replies to them and he says, were those people really worse sinners because they suffered in that way? The term suffering is specifically used there. Were they worse because they have suffered in this way? He then reinforces the point by talking about an incident that obviously the crowd would have known about, where the tower at Siloam has fallen on and killed 18 people. And he says, were those people any worse because that happened to them? So suffering in your life is not a sign that God has taken his favor off you, that you're out of favor or there's something wrong with you. And often it can be very easy to embrace that lie. Now, yes, if we commit sin, and particularly sort of perpetual habits of sin, there is a destruction and a harm that is caused to our human flourishing. There's no doubt that suffering can come through a perpetual, and does come through a perpetual habit in sin. Whenever we sin, what we do is we are moving ourselves away from God. We are diminishing our pathway to human flourishing. We are doing harm to ourselves. So there's no doubt that that can happen. But when you experience suffering, like say for example, you lose a child to cancer, or something awful that is beyond your control happens to you that's got nothing to do with any action on your part, This is not a sign that God now dislikes you or that he is trying to inflict some awful pain on you. No, the reality of the human experience is that suffering is part of that journey. Which brings me to point number 3. Suffering is not the enemy of the good. And this is a common mistake that I think all of us are very prone to falling into. We think that suffering is somehow the thing that destroys good in our life. Over the weekend, I watched one of my favourite modern westerns, Hostiles, and there's a great piece of dialogue in that movie that is delivered by the main female character. She is someone who, in this story, experiences a very painful and traumatic loss. Her husband and her 3 young children, including a young baby, are brutally killed in a Comanche raid on their home. But then not long after that, she's talking to another character who is also experiencing his own personal sufferings. And she delivers this great piece of dialogue when she says, "We'll never get used to the Lord's rough ways, Joseph." She's talking about the way in which God uses suffering for good in our lives and how important that actually is. This is the great mystery, the great paradox of suffering. Because suffering isn't something inconsequential or harmful to the human experience. It is also something that is essential for the fullness of human flourishing. Think about maturity or character. You can't grow in those areas without some form of suffering. Without that suffering, you will tend to be a very superficial person. Your character won't be as complete, as well formed. Not only that, but suffering is an essential component of our capacity to love. In order to love, I talked about this in the previous video where I talked about why suffering was not incompatible with a belief in God. Because without the capacity to suffer, we would not have the capacity for free will, and without the capacity for free will, we can never choose to love another. And for love to be authentic love, it has to be freely given. It can't be forced. So what that means is we need to be able to actually have the freedom to choose to love. But to have that freedom, that also comes with a flip side, and that means the freedom to do evil or to make choices which will cause suffering in our lives or the lives of other people. So the suffering is an essential component of free will, and that is an essential aspect, and without it we cannot actually love. Not only that, but our ability to scale the heights of the human experience is taken away from us if we can't suffer. What do I mean by that? Well, normally our lives are not simply one numb, continuous flat line. They are peaks and troughs. They are highs and lows. And it's when we're in those lows that we are being formed and we are learning how to recognize the profound beauty and goodness of the highs. And so when we find ourselves on the mountaintop after we've been in a dark and difficult valley, we can actually sit in that and we can really experience the fullness of joy because we have a point of contrast. And that is the moments of suffering that we experience. You see, if everything was comfortable in life, ultimately nothing would be comfortable because there would no longer be any lows. There would actually just be one flat line. If everything is comfortable, we have no frame of reference by which to recognize and to participate in those moments of comfort and goodness and to experience joy from them. If everything was beautiful, then nothing would be beautiful. Because if everything was beautiful and we constantly sat in a state of beauty in that same way, we would never have that frame of reference to be able to recognize and to fully participate and to live in that moment of beauty and to revel in it and take great joy and delight by being present in it. So with those basic and brief points in mind, what does a practical Christian response to suffering actually look like? What should we do when we find ourselves in moments of great pain and distress and difficulty and isolation and loneliness and desolation and all of those really big and challenging things that can seem just so overwhelming and all-consuming? Those moments where we think that there is nothing but darkness around us. Well, the first thing I'd say is that prayer is absolutely essential. And when I say prayer, I don't just mean mindlessly uttering things that you think you should be saying that sound holy and nice and righteous. I mean a conversation, a dialogue with God. And the reason I think this is so important is because often what we tend to do is that we actually stop dialoguing with God. We stop that conversation when we find ourselves in moments of great suffering. And then we have a tendency to turn around and say, well, God never actually talked to me. He abandoned me. When in actual fact, what really happened was we never gave him the chance to speak. We just stopped listening. Our suffering was such that we just switched off. And I think prayer is an essential, probably more essential than ever before, thing that we should be doing in those moments where we experience great suffering. Here's the thing about that prayer too. God is not looking for the perfect image of what you think that you are supposed to look like in this situation. He just wants you to be present. If you haven't read it already, read the book of Job. And when you go through sufferings, reread that book again. A story about a man who was present there in the midst of great suffering. One of the things that I think that we've lost sight of is the tradition of lamentation. These prayers where we just brutally and honestly acknowledge the suffering that we find ourselves in, and we're just so honest with God about that suffering. We don't try and hide from it. It's not about a denial of suffering or an escapism. It's about acceptance. But to do lamentation well, you've got to actually be brutally honest with God about what's going on and how you really truly feel about that. God is not looking for a fake version of you in the midst of your suffering. He's not looking for a carefully manicured version of what you think a Christian is supposed to look like. He's looking for you to actually have a conversation with him. He is a loving Father. We are his children. He wants us just to sit and be present with him and to tell honestly how we feel and what is going on. A great example of this is found in the book of Psalms, Psalm 77. I often say to people when they are experiencing great suffering and trials and they don't know what else to do, I would say to them, look, just keep your prayers simple, and if nothing else, open the book of Psalms every day and just read a psalm. Just read it and contemplate it and just be present with it. And in particular, those psalms which are cries of lamentation. Psalm 77 is a really great example of this. And I recently referred someone to the psalm and I said, look, I encourage you, just keep reading this psalm. Just do it once a day and put yourself into this psalm as you do. Let me read you the first half of this psalm and you will see just how powerful the cries of anguish are in this prayer. I cried out to God for help. I cried out to God to hear me. When I was in distress, I sought the Lord. At night, I stretched out untiring hands, and I would not be comforted. I remembered you, God, and I groaned. I meditated, and my spirit grew faint. You kept my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. I thought about the former days, the years of long ago. I remembered my songs in the night. My heart meditated, and my spirit asked, will the Lord reject forever? Will he never show his favour again? Has his unfailing love vanished forever? Has his promise failed for all time? Has God forgotten to be merciful? Has he in anger withheld his compassion? There is no denying that that is a brutal, unflinching, heartfelt cry that comes from a place of absolute and total honesty. This is a man who is praying, God, why have you abandoned me? Where are you? That is the posture. That is what we need to adopt in those moments of suffering. Just be honest and be brutally honest. Here's the interesting thing about that psalm, and this is really what's so important. I think about these prayers of lamentation, is it goes on then in the second half of the psalm, not to say, oh, it's all good, everything's okay now, but to say, in spite of this, I am going to profess an unwavering hope, an unwavering belief that God will actually come to my aid, that he will still work, he is still working, and I'm going to express that trust even though right now that is the furthest thing from my mind. And I think that is the model of prayer that we need to embrace. We also need to allow space for silence. What we often tend to do is we often talk at God, and we forget that it's supposed to be a conversation. We don't allow him just to talk to us, directly to us in our hearts and say, hey, here's what you need to hear. In order for that conversation to happen, we need to leave a space for silence. So start by being real, but also pause in the silence and allow God to respond to you. Your prayers should be simple and straightforward. Don't think that you've got to utter something profound and deep and wondrous and long and some great biblical Old Testament style way of speaking. Just tell God in your own words. Think about how you talk to your own father, your own mother, your own children, your brothers, your sisters, your friends, your loved ones. And when you are in a moment where you have intimate conversation with them, how do you talk? Talk that same way with God. Be that honest, that open, and that raw with Him. Read the lives of the saints, the great men and women of the Christian faith who have gone before us. When you read their lives, one thing that you will notice is that their sanctity is not actually a path marked by great freedom and liberation and lots of fun and self-gratification. What is so intimately connected with their journeys is trial and suffering and hardship. And it is in those moments where you can see God is doing His most profound and important shaping work. So understand those and those who have role modeled this path through suffering before us, and see and learn and listen and glean what we can from that. Here's another really important thing just to finish with. Speak to God like He is really there present in the room with you. We often talk to God as if He is distant and as if He is far away. He's not. He's right there. So speak to Him in that same way. Be honest. Call Him Father. Ask for His help. And if that means just simply praying the same simple prayer in the midst of your suffering every day, such as, God, show me where you are in the midst of all of this. God, show yourself to me. God, where are you? If that's your prayer and that's all you pray, just keep praying it. Be straightforward with God. Don't pray like He's somewhere else in the house. Don't pray like you have to conform to some special image of what you think a righteous and holy praying person is. God just wants to be present with you and to have that conversation. The last thing I'd say too is when you find yourself in moments of great suffering, don't panic and don't feel like it's not supposed to be this way. But what I would say also on the flip side is don't wallow in that suffering. Try and remember that the call of Christianity is always a call to self-giving love, and that includes even in the moments of suffering. So even when we go through deep and profound sufferings, and we allow ourselves the time and the space to be present in the midst of that difficult and challenging grief, we should also never stop engaging in acts of self-giving love. Because I think they are the thing which begin to draw us out of that difficulty and that darkness. They are the moments when we are imaging the very profound and wondrous image of who God is at the heart of His being. This community of self-giving love. And when we do that, when we image that, I think we begin to recover ourselves and our own identity. And we begin to recover a sense of stability even in the midst of great suffering and darkness. Thanks again for tuning into this episode of A Question of Faith. If you've found it beneficial, then please consider supporting the work that I'm doing. You can do that for as little as $1 a month at Patreon. You can find the link for that at the end of this video, but it's patreon.com/leftfootmedia. Every little bit helps, and it means that I can keep producing this sort of content. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you next time on A Question of Faith.